We used to joke amongst the team that Lewis's performance was so intrinsically linked to the state of their relationship. You could clearly track the performance in the car to the way their relationship status seemed to be. And we joke that there seemed to be more lap time in keeping those two together than there ever could be with anything we could do with the car. Hi, I'm Mark Priestley. I spent almost a decade at the McLaren Formula One team alongside inspirational people such as Kimi Raikkonen, Lewis Hamilton, Fernando Alonso, but also people like Adrian Newey and Ron Dennis. I created the Pitlane Life Lessons Podcast to share many of those things that I've learnt with you to help you to think about the challenges in your life a little bit more like a Formula One team might think about them. Enjoy. Hey everybody, welcome back. In this week's episode, I'm talking about Lewis Hamilton. In 2025, a Ferrari driver. Who would have seen that coming? But what I want to talk about is Lewis Hamilton's 2024 and some of the years that preceded that as well. Because in 2024, Lewis's last year at Mercedes, it was a real difficult, troublesome year for Lewis, with some highs but lots of lows as well. And if you remember towards the end of that season, there were a number of days when we saw Lewis seemingly at some pretty low points. His post-race interviews were pretty down, and obviously the results weren't coming. He was finding it very frustrating inside the car to deliver the results that he wanted or expected. He was being consistently beaten by his teammate, George Russell, and over time you could clearly see that was starting to get to Lewis. It was surprising to some people to see Lewis just so down at the end of some races. You may remember quotes where he even talked about him not being fast anymore. There were talks of him even leaving the team early because things were becoming so difficult and he was so down. He's given interviews and conversations since where he's talked about many of the difficulties he's had, not just in 2024, but difficulties throughout his life and career, struggling to manage his own emotions, even to the point of having depression at times in his life. And I know for many of us, many of you, I'm sure, looking on from the outside, it would be very easy to look at Lewis Hamilton and say, 7-time world champion, the most successful driver in the history of Formula One. He's got the world at his feet. He is literally the king of this sport. How on earth can he be so down? It's easy to look at somebody like that as this superstar, this hero who is almost superhuman. And at times, we've all been guilty, I'm sure, of looking at him and other people in sport and business through that kind of lens, where you believe they're so different to you because of the results they've been able to achieve in whatever platform they're operating within. Lewis is one of those examples. I've been fortunate enough to work with Lewis, and even still, I look at him sometimes and I think, wow, how on earth is he able to do what he's been able to do? He goes on to inspire millions and millions of people, both within the sport and beyond it. He has created his own businesses. He works for other businesses. Everything he seems to do is at such a high level. And yet on certain days at the end of 2024, he seemed like every one of us when we're having a bad day. When it feels like nothing's going your way, nothing you do is going to turn those results around, and it almost feels like giving up. And that's what I saw from Lewis Hamilton. And I know that it shocked many of you. I just wanted to reflect on some of that and point out the obvious fact that he is, of course, human. And all of us have those moments when it feels like things have gone so far against us, and no matter what we try, it's not changing the results. We're not getting luck going our way. We're not getting results coming our way. And it can feel, like I said, like it's not worth carrying on. Certainly not with the amount of effort and sacrifice and dedication required to be a Formula One driver at the highest level. You can easily see how it could get to that point. Now, when we saw Lewis talking in that way, I found it really quite sad. I don't want to see what is one of our heroes operating at such a low ebb, when actually what he's become famous for and inspirational for, and on a personal level, having seen it up close, he's inspirational to me for the amount of dedication and effort, how he's able to show up with such positivity on such a relentless basis over years and years now. And yet we didn't see that. In fact, we saw the opposite of that. And I found it hard to watch. I'm sure many of you did too. So I wanted to look at that, reflect on that, and obviously look at it within the context of our lives and how we might, when we're finding ourselves in situations like that, help to start turning things around. Because one of the things I know about Lewis Hamilton, particularly having worked up close with him for a period of time at McLaren, and I've worked with him in the media sense over the years that have followed, is I know that he's very, very good at turning these situations around. One thing Lewis does is he wears his heart on his sleeve. And I love that about him, by the way. You get the raw emotion when it's there. Whether that's on a good day, the outpouring of love for his team and the people around him that you see when he's won a race or a championship. But on the flip side of that, in exactly the same way, you see the outpouring of negative emotion when he's down. He doesn't have this ability to regulate those and to check himself necessarily in the heat of the moment when a camera's in his face or he's in the car with the team radio on, in the heat of battle. Adrenaline's pumping. You get a real picture of what Lewis Hamilton is feeling inside, sometimes coming through the television or the interview to millions and millions of people. And that's something that most of us are not faced with in life. When we're having a down day, quite often we tend to keep it to ourselves. We tend to shut ourselves away. We don't want to talk to people, and we try and manage it just internally, which is a difficult thing to do. Talking about it clearly when you're struggling is a really positive situation, a positive way out of these things for lots of people. And by the way, if in any case you're struggling with any of the subjects that we cover on today's episode, there will be some links in the description of this podcast that you might be able to go and get some help if you want to go and do so. So have a look at those if you're feeling that way. But in terms of Lewis, this idea of being able to switch things around, when you have these low moments, one of the things I know from working with Lewis is that he's often been able to bounce back from those. At McLaren, I've seen many days when things weren't going his way in the early years, when he's tried everything, he's maybe had a great result the week before, but the week after he's been consistently outdone by a teammate or a competitor. He's trying things in the car and with the engineering team that just aren't working, and the car seemingly getting worse. We see the real Lewis Hamilton. We see the emotion pouring out of Lewis Hamilton in those moments. I've been there on the end of radio messages when he's shouting and screaming, or whether he's getting frustrated, or whether he's feeling down like we've heard towards the end of 2024. It's difficult to hear some of those messages when you're so closely linked to it. But the other side that I've seen from Lewis is quite often the very next day, he'll show up back in that same garage, get back into that same car with a completely different outlook on life, on the mission at hand. He'll turn up full of positivity, and that will radiate throughout the team. He has lifted me on many occasions when it seems like the weekend's going in the wrong direction, and yet on a Sunday maybe he'll turn up after a very difficult Saturday with a newfound confidence, with a newfound outlook, which is so positive that it spills through the rest of the team and the rest of the people in that garage, and we all gradually take on a little bit of that for ourselves. That's a powerful ability to have. So I wanted to try and pick apart how he's able to do that, first of all, some of the methods and tools that he uses in his own armoury, because I've asked him about this, I've had conversations with him about this, and how we might be able to apply some of that to our own lives. As I said, getting into the realms of clinical depression and more serious issues, that's the time when maybe you do need to go and talk to somebody and seek professional help. But in these moments I'm talking about here, in the context of Formula One, we look at emotions and the emotions of the humans involved in our teams in Formula One through the metric and the lens of performance. Like we look at everything in Formula One. Everything is measured by how it's going to impact performance. So we would look at the car, of course, the way that is performing on track. We'll look at the pit stop crew, the tyre performance. We'll look at the preparation, the strategy. Everything is looked at through a lens of performance. And what I mean by that is, how is each of those individual things going to contribute to our performance as a team over the course of a race weekend or a season? So it might be buying a new piece of equipment for the factory. If there's a decision to be made about an expensive piece of kit, we would look at that through a lens of performance. By spending this considerable amount of money, which, by the way, today comes off a restricted budget cap, of course, in Formula One today, we have to weigh up whether the money we're going to spend is going to contribute to our performance or detract from it. You could easily look at it and say, well, look, if you're buying a great piece of equipment, of course it's going to contribute to it. But what about if the money you have to spend on that has to be taken from another department? Well, then you have to weigh up the taking away the budget from one department and giving it to another to buy the piece of equipment. What's the knock-on effect of those things? Is it a net positive, or could it be a net negative or net neutral? All of these are the factors and the decisions that are made when spending money, committing time and resource, effort, looking at every aspect of what we do. We weigh it up against overall performance. And today in Formula One, which we didn't do years ago, emotions and a human's state of mind is just as much a part of that. Looking at the state of mind of the people involved in a team, and I don't just mean the drivers, can have clearly a significant at times knock-on impact to the overall performance of our team. If I go way back, we didn't really consider that. We looked at just the car. It was all about car performance. All the budget went on that. All the time and the resource pretty much went on the car. How can we knock another tenth of a second off the lap time? By spending another £200,000 on a front wing or a floor. That was the only measure of success we had. It was lap time. We didn't really consider any of the humans in our team. And then as time progressed, we began to look at the drivers a bit more like athletes. And, they stopped smoking and drinking, and they had trainers, and they started working out. They started looking after their own health. And then gradually, as a period of time after that passed, we began to understand that the mental performance of these drivers also has a major impact. So now a lot of the drivers use their own mind coaches or psychologists to help them to prepare for going into battle on a race weekend, or to getting ready in terms of their preparation for a season, for example. Thanks so much for getting this far through today's episode. I would love it if you could interact somehow with the Pitlane Life Lessons podcast by dropping us a like or a comment, a rating, wherever it is you're listening or watching. It really makes a massive difference. Back to the episode. And as time progressed even further, the wider teams and Formula One as a whole began to appreciate this performance-related link to a person's mindset and state of well-being isn't solely just restricted to the drivers. Of course, a team is made up of over 1,000 people now in Formula One. Every single one of them contributing something to the overall performance, and every single one of those people affected by their current state of mind, what thoughts they've got running through their head, how happy they are, how fit and healthy they are, what their state of well-being is. All of those things for all of those people have an impact. So now in modern day Formula One, and at the very highest level of competition which Formula One teams are operating at, we have to consider those things because it affects our performance. And so the topics we're talking about here are things that are front and centre for most top level Formula One teams. So to come back to Lewis Hamilton, and we'll go back way back when he first came into this sport, we were starting to appreciate this real understanding of mindset and thought processes, mental preparation and psychology on the impact of our team's performance. And Lewis was one of the drivers in the first part of that wave to really benefit, but also, crucially, to embrace that understanding. Now, Lewis, as I touched on it already, is a guy who's quite emotional. He wears his heart on his sleeve, like I said. So without the ability to really control those emotions to the level that some other people might be able to do or might find easier to do, we were faced with an unbelievably talented racing driver whose performance was in some way affected by how his emotional state was, which varied greatly at different times over a race weekend or a season. One of the things, which now I can look back and see as quite amusing, he was in a relationship with Nicole Scherzinger at the time. You may remember when he first came into this sport. We used to joke amongst the team that Lewis's performance was so intrinsically linked to the state of their relationship, as in on a good day he performed well. When their relationship was in the doldrums and they were so off and on, it was a bit like an emotional roller coaster. When he was in these low points in the relationship, you could clearly track the performance in the car to the way their relationship status seemed to be. And we joke that there seemed to be more lap time in keeping those two together than there ever could be with anything we could do with the car. But there was a serious point to that, in that it was about understanding and appreciating that Lewis's emotional state clearly affected his performance. And this is not linked just to Lewis Hamilton, of course. We all face these challenges in life. Some of us find it slightly easier to manage and regulate emotions, and others of us don't. It's not a strength necessarily or a weakness. It's just part of who we are and our individualism. Lewis has some unbelievable strengths that many of us can only dream of being able to achieve, but emotion regulation is probably not one of the things that he finds easiest to do. And actually, there's a lot of good that comes from having that trait as part of your character. As I said, when he wins a race, when he has a big moment of success, getting that real raw emotion come out across the radio, or when he steps back into the garage, winning the championship in 2008, I saw that up close and personal. You know, the hugs, the high fives, the leaping around when he got back to that garage in Brazil at the end of that season, that was raw. There was nothing staged about that. That was the real Lewis Hamilton. And I can tell you the effect that it had on me and many of my colleagues, seeing Lewis climb out of a car and be so grateful, so happy, so overwhelmed with emotion. That was powerful on us. It gave us this enormous lift. It carried us maybe for months, maybe even into the years that followed. But the other side is that when emotions are down, performance is down. And as I said, we will go into work in our daily lives, in our businesses, we'll go into the office. We might have had an argument with the other half. We might have just opened a traumatic bill that came in that morning, and you're a bit down. Your emotions are down. Your mind's racing and can't think about anything else. And when you get into the office, there's a very high chance your performance in whatever job you do will be at a slightly lower level than it would have been on another day when you started the day in a really positive sense. Now, sometimes we have control over that, and others, these moments come along that we simply can't manage, that we simply can't control. What I want to talk to you about is how Lewis found a way to manage some of those, to kind of understand what was going on in his own life and mitigate against them on many occasions, and how maybe we can do something similar. It doesn't mean that we can eradicate these moments from life. It just means that if we constantly look at how they might impact our performance, and by the very fact that you're listening to this podcast, I'm going to go and assume that you're on a journey, like I am, and like many of us are, of trying to get closer to our own version of high performance. We're trying to maximize the outcomes that we get in our lives. We're trying to up our game. And that's what this podcast exists to try and help you do. And so if we're trying to up our game, understanding the things that can affect us both positively and negatively is a really important key part of that. Lewis Hamilton, when he was struggling, when he's having those tough days, as I said, he might have had a difficult Saturday. He'll come out of the car on a Saturday after qualifying when it's been disappointing, and he would go away that evening and he'd be very quiet, he'd be very down. He wouldn't offer very much in terms of the debrief. Actually, you could easily look at his comments in a post-session debrief after a really difficult Saturday, and he could come across as being petulant. It was often one-word answers. It was the same sort of thing you see in an interview sometimes that you see post-race in the modern era. He can sometimes give flippant answers or one-word answers that are not in any way really helpful to the process. And as engineers, our only goal was to try and improve things so that it could be better the next day or the next time out. To get the driver, who's a key part of that debrief, in a state where he's just throwing petulance, answers that are unhelpful to you because he's so down, that's not in any way productive and doesn't help us get closer to a solution. But he'd often go away on a Saturday night. He'd disappear and I wouldn't see him on a Saturday evening. He would sometimes even cancel commitments to sponsors and partners. He would disappear. And I suspect, and I think, he shut himself away in a room and he probably pondered over it for quite some time, digging himself into an even bigger and deeper hole, is how he's described it to me in years gone by. He moulded over in his mind and continued to tell himself that same story, that he wasn't doing a good enough job. He would beat himself up emotionally. He would completely reiterate the negative thought processes that he'd been having that afternoon right through into the night until he went to sleep. But one thing he was quite good at was waking up the next day with a fresh perspective. And he always said to me that this was a new day, a new set of opportunities. This was a case of coming in to try and do it better. And if you ever see a TV interview on a Sunday morning after a Saturday afternoon where he struggled in qualifying, even today, that's generally what you get. You get a new Lewis Hamilton, where he's no longer down, he's no longer struggling with emotions. He's now got this fresh perspective where he sees nothing but opportunity in front of him. He may not have expectations that he might have had going into Saturday. His expectations might have had to be reset. But in doing so, he takes away some pressure. He relieves himself of that burden that was overwhelming him on a Saturday. And we go into Sunday with a Lewis that's just there, ready to take the opportunities, to push like crazy. And how often do we see a way better Sunday than we see him have on a Saturday? That was the same quite often, even way back when he first came into the sport, working with us at McLaren. As time progressed and Lewis became more in touch with his own emotions, and I know this, by the way, because in 2023, I did a big interview with him for one of Mercedes' brands where I spent the whole afternoon just picking his brains on all of this kind of stuff, how he'd managed to achieve some of the great successes in his life, understanding what he now knew about himself that he didn't know back in the day that's helped him to go on and be this icon of the sport that we know and love. And some of his answers are what I'm now sharing with you in the context of this conversation. He told me, and has told me on a number of occasions, that over the course of around 2020, certainly through the pandemic, the global pandemic, he discovered the power of meditation. And what he said to me was that, going back to this idea, this example of a difficult Saturday, for example, where he comes away from a qualifying session on a Saturday after a disappointing result for whatever reason, beating himself up all the way to the point where he goes to sleep, and sometimes even beyond when he wakes up. He said he came to an understanding and an appreciation that clearly that wasn't good for him. And the more that he kept telling himself that story, that it was his fault, that he wasn't good enough, and we go back to that conversation of that interview that I heard at the end of 2024 that I'm sure you all heard too, where he came out of the car on a Saturday and he even quoted to say, "I'm just not fast anymore." That's Lewis telling himself a story in his own mind that then backs up the beliefs that he isn't good enough. And the more he hears that story internally, the more substantiated it becomes, the more ingrained in his own belief system that message becomes. And it's the same for all of us. If we continually tell ourselves that we have messed something up, that it was our fault, that maybe we start to question our own ability, our own performance levels, whatever it is, whether we're getting old and we can't do things the way we used to, which I've no doubt has crept into Lewis's mind at times. The more we tell ourselves those stories, the more that story embeds itself in our mind. And what happens when that situation occurs is that over time, we'll have another disappointing day, and the first thing our mind goes to is this embedded self-story that we're not good enough. That the reason that it hasn't gone well on a Saturday in qualifying or in our own lives and whatever might have not worked out the way we expected, we jump to this embedded self-story that we've been telling ourselves, sometimes for years in many people's cases, that we're simply not good enough, or that we're not as good as the people around us. In Formula One, it's really easy to look at other great people in this sport, other teams that might be winning or drivers that might be winning, and measure ourselves against them. And if you're going up against a Max Verstappen, for example, who's much younger than a Lewis Hamilton that's now in his 40s, if you're measuring yourself up against that guy, one of the stories you're likely to start allowing to creep in is that age must be the factor. Because I used to be able to beat him. I used to be able to beat everybody. Well, now look, I'm verging on 40. I'm creeping into the latter stages of my career. Maybe that's the reason that I'm now being beaten by this young gun. Well, the reality is it may be that, but there's a very high chance it's not that. It may be that you've had a couple of bad days. It may be that you're still performing at a very high level, but someone else has come along that's performing at a higher level. That's real. And that's okay, by the way. We can't control what others do around us, only what we control about what we do ourselves. And so that self-story is a crucial and important part of how we manage the self-belief and the self-confidence that's deep buried within us in the subconscious moments when something hasn't quite gone well. Lewis told me he's been working constantly on trying to correct that self-story. He's been working on trying to understand what he can do differently about what he tells himself. And I'm not necessarily talking about speaking out loud here. I'm talking about the thought processes, the constant conversations we all have with ourselves. The person we speak to most in this world, for all of us, is ourselves. And we do that all the time, don't we? We ask ourselves questions. We tell ourselves things. We question our ability at times. Sometimes it might be telling us positive things. And that's what Lewis said he'd been trying to work on doing. Constantly telling himself positive things over and above negative things, even when negative things had been happening. Now, he finds that quite a difficult thing to do because of that disposition that he has around finding it hard to regulate his own emotions. His emotional state can be so overwhelmingly powerful for him that if something negative happens, it's very difficult to remember this idea of trying to be confident, to be positive, to tell yourself a good self-story when the emotion bubbles up to such an extent it takes over. You then lose control in that situation and the negativity can creep in, and that still clearly happens to Lewis today. So the first stage that he always said and recommends to everybody was that trying to be positive, trying to correct the self-story is a really important first step. But of course, there's an understanding that's not always going to be possible. Some situations are so powerfully emotional, you have lost control before you've even got a chance to regain it. So as soon as you can, of course, try and remember this idea of correcting yourself, telling yourself something positive, telling yourself what might be the reality over and above what your emotions are telling you has gone wrong. All of that is really worth noting and really worth trying to have in the back of your mind so that when the emotion starts to stabilize a little bit, common sense can set in. You can realize what the mission that you're trying to be on here is and correct yourself and set yourself straight. But the biggest point that Lewis said has changed his life is, as I said, over the period of the global pandemic, around 2020 or 2021, he said he discovered meditation. And this was all about trying to clear his mind after what might have happened the day before and reset it ready for what was coming the following day. And he said that was so powerful. And I can, a testament to this because I now do this myself, partly off the back of what Lewis told me last year. I know that this emotion, the emotional turmoil that's often running around in your mind when something, particularly in something like sport, which is so emotionally charged anyway, when a difficult day happens, the turmoil, the turbulence that's going on in your mind can really stop anything positive getting in because it's so chaotic in there. I've felt it myself, I'm sure many of you have, even to the point of getting to bed that night and you lie down on the pillow and all you want to do is go to sleep, but all you can actually think of is this mess or chaos that's going on in your head, kicked off by something difficult that happened either that day or a challenge you might be facing the next. A key turning point for Lewis, and one that I can absolutely see why it works, is this understanding of creating a clear space in your mind. And meditation can be a really powerful way of doing that intentionally. If we just don't do anything intentional and allow these emotions, this turbulence to continue, it will continue. And quite often it will even grow. And remember when I talked about all of our emotional states impacting our performance, the more we allow that turbulence and that messy, chaotic situation in the mind to continue to grow, the more negativity it's likely to inflict on our performance when we next need it most. So to try and stop that, Lewis has found a way of creating an area of space in his mind, a period of time where he allows nothing to go on in his mind other than this very intentional thought through his meditation. Now, of course, there are hundreds of different types of meditations. There's so many different ways that you can create that space. On a personal level, I know that in the morning, I try and do it through just a simple breathing exercise. I try and focus on nothing other than my own breath for a period of time. And the longer I'm able to do that, the more clear-headed I find I am at the end of it. And when I'm clear-headed, I've got space to then focus on whatever it is I want to focus on. My mind isn't taking over. I've taken over my mind, and I can then insert the fresh thoughts, the fresh preparations for whatever's in the day lying ahead. And this was exactly what Lewis said to me he tried to do in his own life. He creates that freedom and space by eradicating everything and thinking about just one single thing, whether it's your breath or a kind of mantra that you repeat to yourself, whatever it might be. You can think of your own version of meditation that works for you. But it's something that's intentional, that stops the flow of any other thoughts getting in. Because the truth is, we can, although it seems chaotic and messy, like there's hundreds of thoughts swirling around our minds at once in that time, the truth is we can actually only ever think of one thing at once. Our minds aren't capable of thinking of two things at the same time. We often think we are, but we're not. In those moments, we're actually zipping from one thought to another. We can only think of one thing. So if we choose what that one thing is going to be, whether it's focusing on your breath or a mantra or whatever you want to do in terms of a meditation, if you're intentional about what the thought is, the one thought you're going to think about, and focus everything on it, there is no space for anything else to come in. And that's the way you create a period of space in your mind. You calm things down. You create this blank space where at the end of that meditation, where you're feeling calm, you're feeling relaxed, but importantly, your mind is free of all of the mess that was in it before. Now you get to start from afresh, like a blank sheet of paper, where you can insert whatever you want to happen next. And for me, what I do is I write a journal, and I put in that journal some of my intentions for the day. So after I've done this period of deep breathing and meditation, I've cleared some space, I then immediately go from that into setting some of my intentions for the day. Now, those intentions are obviously positive. I try and make them as positive as I can, because that's the first thing that's going to go into my mind after I've done the meditation practice. And Lewis is exactly the same. He says when he wakes up early, and he gets up super early to do this, I think for him, he said he does the meditation, he clears his mind, and then he goes straight out for a run off the back of that. He goes into an exercise regime, which is obviously part of his physical preparation. But because he's got clear mind and a clear space in his head, when he goes for a run, he's able to think about what he wants to achieve that day, whether it's in a car or in any other area of his life. This is a really powerful practice, which does take some skill and some practice. It's not something that, when I first started trying this meditation, for me, what I tried to do was think about my breath going in and going out again. And what happens was every few seconds, these thoughts would try and rush in and block what I was actually trying to focus on. That happens. That's perfectly normal. I had to allow those thoughts to come in, and then I sort of kicked them out again. I intentionally got rid of them and brought the focus back to the breath. And when you do that over time, it becomes easier and easier to maintain the focus. So it is a skill that can be improved upon by practicing over time. So this idea of clearing space is a really important part of managing your emotional state to prepare yourself for building a more positive one moving forward. And if you bring that back to the context of performance, it's a really good way to start your day, particularly if you've got something major you need to try and achieve that day. Going into an exam or a job interview or a big day at work with chaos in your mind is clearly going to be very difficult to focus on the things that will help you to achieve whatever it is you need to achieve that day. Performance is linked directly to your emotional state. So trying to create a positive emotional state is going to help create a more positive outcome in your performance. So that's Lewis Hamilton's idea around meditation, around clearing the mind and resetting the mind. He was able to do that very, very successfully. He says he only started the meditation practices around 2020 or off the back of the pandemic, but it was something I noticed in him right from his early days. He didn't do it in quite such an intentional way, but he was definitely able to come back after a good night's sleep and come back on a Sunday, like I said, with a very different point of view, a very different mindset, and that translated into his performance. So Lewis has clearly got better at managing these things over time. And that's another really important point here, because this is a practice. Managing emotions and building self-confidence, regulating your self-belief, it's a practice that we can improve upon. No baby is born full of confidence. No human is born full of confidence. It's something that is the result of our experiences and the story that we live, but crucially the story we tell ourselves along that journey. And so by changing and thinking about the story we tell ourselves, we can change the level of self-confidence, the level of self-belief, that we feel. And as a result of those things, we're able to much more effectively manage our emotions. It doesn't mean we're not going to experience the big highs and the big lows. It just means, like Lewis, that when we have the big lows, we're able to come back from them more quickly, to regulate them more quickly, to bring ourselves back on track and to act in the right way. I think one really powerful example of this was Lewis Hamilton at the end of that really controversial Abu Dhabi 2021 race. Don't come at me with opinions on this. I've heard them all. But I just want to talk about how Lewis reacted at the end of what must have been a crushing defeat. Unfair on so many levels, really powerful. And for someone who struggles to manage emotions historically in their lives, going through the process that I've just talked about, I said prior to that race, he'd been learning and practicing this idea of meditation, this understanding of clearing his mind, creating a different self-story in his own brain that will help him to recover from these things quicker. Today I record this podcast is actually 3 years to the day of that race in Abu Dhabi. And I read a quote earlier from Lewis where he was talking about the moments when he got out the car at the end of that Grand Prix. And just put yourself in his position on that day. Imagine what that must have felt like. Winning a world championship, even when you've already got 7, is massive. Not just for you, but for hundreds or thousands of people around you that have helped you on that journey. For him, of course, it would have been an 8th. It would have set him into a new realm of Formula One driver, having achieved something that nobody in the history of the sport has ever done. This was big. You know, Lewis does like to have records like that. This meant the world to him. Make no mistake. Don't fall into the misjudgment of thinking, well, he's already got 7, one more didn't matter. This one mattered. And at the end of that race, because of the way it panned out, I can only begin to imagine how he must have been feeling on that in-lap, having known he's just lost the world title to someone, a bitter, fierce rival that's been difficult along the journey at times, through a set of circumstances that seemed so unfair in those moments. And yet he pulled into Parc Ferme at the end of that race. He sat in his car and gathered his thoughts for a moment. And the quote that I read said, he said, the next 50 metres that he takes, the next few moments of his life will be powerful. They will help to define him. They'll be more powerful than anything he could have ever done in a car. They mattered most. What he did next off the back of that defeat, that crushing blow, that mattered more than anything that he'd done in the build-up to it. And as I'm sure you will be well aware, he got out of that car, he went up to Max Verstappen and he congratulated him. For someone who struggles to manage emotion historically, imagine how difficult, how traumatic that must have been. Because what must have been going on inside his head at that time must have been, I can't even imagine how traumatic and turbulent that must have been. He must have been experiencing all kinds of thoughts and processes going on. And yet he was able to somehow rise above all of those things and do what he knew was right. It was a class act. He walked over, he congratulated Max on becoming a new world champion. And I think for millions of people to watch on and see that will have inspired so many people, children, to react in their own difficult moments in a similar way, in the right way. It was huge. And the only way he was able to do that was through continual practice and preparation, through an understanding of his own emotional state, how his own brain and mind works at times of difficulty. We learn that through going through the emotional roller coaster that is our lives, the ups and downs that are affecting us every single day. Every one of our days of our lives have fed into this data bank of experience that we now know better than anyone else how we deal with those certain situations. Lewis came to the realization, the conclusion, that that wasn't something he found very easy, and therefore, just like when he needed to work on a certain part of his body physically, he would put effort into that in the gym. He put effort and time and work into understanding and practicing regulating those emotions, getting better at dealing with negative situations that he faced. The meditation will have helped that. The practicing, telling himself a more positive story. The intentional thought processes in his mind, trying to overcome the unintentional ones that naturally creep in those times. Practicing those over and over again are what led to what was a hugely powerful moment, I'm sure for many of us, but also for him at the end of that 2021 season. It was massive. And it really hammered home to me. And when I spoke to him in 2023 about some of these things, it really hammered home how we can have some level of control of how we react to the difficult times in life. And we will all face them. That's inevitable. No matter what wave of positivity we're on, no matter how good our life is going, everything changes. Nothing stays the same forever. We can be winning at everything. You can be winning at Formula One like Lewis Hamilton did for so many years, and then things will change. Someone else will come along, or you won't have such a good car that year. You might make the odd mistake. Something will happen which determines that you may not win on those occasions. And that can be crushing. It can be difficult. So it's inevitable that those days are going to happen, and understanding how best to deal with them has a direct impact on our performance in those moments. Lewis's performance at the end of that Abu Dhabi 2021 race when he got out of the car, and that was still part of his performance, is how he showed up and behaved and acted in front of the world. Part of his performance was linked to the practice and the preparation that he'd put in for many years before that, knowing those difficult moments would come along again. It helps him on that day. I'm sure it's helped him on many other days too. And at the end of the 2024 season, when things seem to be getting on top of him, it's another reminder that something worse than you might have ever experienced before comes along. Lewis is coming to the end of the most successful partnership, perhaps in sports history, between a team and a sports person, a team and driver in Formula One. They had created unbelievable success together. And yet in that final year, building up to the emotional departure before he moves on to pastures new, the car wasn't where they wanted it to be. They had an up and down season where results came good on certain days, but yet on other days they were utterly lost and couldn't figure out. They had more questions than answers. That's difficult. For someone who's emotional, that's a series of spikes and troughs on a graph that can be very difficult to handle. And we saw with Lewis in 2024, it was clearly difficult to handle. No matter the level of preparation, no matter what we try and train for, what we prepare for, what expectations we have as being a worst case scenario, or how we think things will play out, there will always be something in our lives that disrupts that. There'll be something that comes along and hits us harder than we thought it ever could. Both negatively, but also perhaps positively on some days too. We have to be as ready as we can for those moments, because something else has to happen immediately after those moments happen. Like Lewis getting out of the car in Abu Dhabi, something else has to happen next. It's not the end of our journey, is it? The difficult moment is not the end. A difficult qualifying is not the end of a race weekend. Something else has to happen. We have to choose what to do next. We have to take some actions, which means our performance is going to be affected by what's happened before if we allow it to. The point of this episode, I hope that you can see through this, and I hope you're taking away from this, is that we face those moments all of the time. It's a spectrum. It's a whole range of different things that happen to us that affect our emotions on an equally sort of endless scale. And we're always on some form of that scale, some point on that scale on every single day. Some days we might be right near the top because things are going well, and we maybe think we don't need to worry about our emotions because everything's working out. And others will be right down the other end, and it will feel overwhelming, like there's no point in getting up or getting out of bed and taking that next step. The point that Lewis Hamilton has drummed home to me, and I hope I'm passing on to you, is that we always have to take that next step. There isn't really a choice. The only choice is what step we actually take, what we do in that next step, which action we decide to take next. And as you saw at the end of Abu Dhabi in 2021, the decision we make in those tough moments can be really powerful. For him, that was in front of the world. Kids were looking up to him for inspiration on what to do in difficult moments, and he gave them the best possible message. For us, it might be a decision that affects our job, a sport. It might be our family. We might be showing up in front of our own kids in a similar way, creating an example and preparing for those moments, even though we don't know what's on the horizon, is a valuable part of delivering the performance that's required to get the best out of whether it's our lives or a Formula One team. Understanding what we can do to impact that performance is a big part of that preparation. And a couple of examples I've given you just to reflect on them today. Thinking about meditation, it's not for everybody, but I know it's helped me. Lewis absolutely has convinced me that it's helped him as well. It can be a short process. I probably take 10 minutes in the morning to do that, but I know it helps me. It's changed the way I then show up for a day. It's changed the way I turn up and the way I feel about turning up. For Lewis, it's the same. But also, meditation being a great thing. The other is really convincing yourself and being intentional about the thoughts that you put into your own mind. Telling yourself that self-story, which is so powerful in impacting the way that you behave. We're in control of that self-story. If we take focus away from it, it can easily control us, and our emotions will dictate the story, and that will lead us off sometimes down a very negative path. But if we do manage to take control, if we're intentional about it, and more importantly, if we're aware how important it is, we can then come back to the focus. We can then come back to dictating what we tell ourselves, what story we tell ourselves, the messages we give ourselves in our brain, and we can practice those over and over again. You can do it in the shower. You can do it in the car on your way to work. If you are out for a run, really great time. Create a self-story in your mind. Those moments really can shape the way you show up and therefore what your performance looks like. So I hope that throughout that, comparing 7-time world champion Lewis Hamilton, someone who has been at the pinnacle of this sport, and yet seeing that he's still human and still has the low moments and that they can play out for him in front of the world, makes it real. I hope we can all relate to that, because every single one of us will have been through times like that. It's just typically we do it in private. Absolutely. Talk to other people. And as I said, if you're affected by these things and it's even more serious and you feel like you need some help, go check out the links in the description of this video. There are lots of services that can help you, particularly if you need medical help with this thing, if it becomes very serious. But on our own personal level, if we think about our lives through the lens of performance, like a Formula One team looks at everything, our emotional state, the way that we think and our thought process has a massive impact on our end performance in whatever it is we do. So taking some level of control back over that can be massively powerful. I hope you found some of that useful. I want to say a big thank you to all of you for listening or watching, and for any of you that have sent me messages over recent episodes and over past seasons of the Pitlane Life Lessons podcast. I really appreciate it. Please keep that coming. Any interaction with the show helps it more than I can possibly tell you. So please leave me a like, a review, drop me a comment, leave me a rating in the podcast store, wherever you get your pods from. It would be really, really appreciated. And until I see you again, don't forget this. Do the right things, do the things right.